It started like any other morning patrol for the Coast Guard. The sun was barely up, and the sea was calm enough to make you forget how unpredictable it could turn. The crew was running routine checks on vessels along the coast, nothing out of the ordinary, just standard safety inspections. They had a list of boats to verify, a few names to cross off, and the goal was simple: keep the waters safe, keep things moving. These operations happen all the time. Most boat owners were cooperative, some mildly annoyed at the delay, but everyone understood it was just part of keeping order out there. As the patrol boat approached a mid-sized fishing vessel anchored farther out than usual, the team noticed something slightly off. The boat wasn't listed on the regular schedule, and it wasn't broadcasting any distress or communication signal. Normally, that alone wouldn't raise red flags. People sometimes forgot to update their logs, but the timing and location made it odd. The officer in charge decided to board for a quick check. The call went out over the radio, and the crew got ready to move in. They'd done this hundreds of times. Approach, announce, inspect, clear. Routine. From a distance, the fishing vessel looked well-maintained but had no name painted on the side, which was unusual. The Coast Guard team pulled up beside it, secured their ropes, and climbed aboard. A man stood near the bow, watching them quietly, his hands in his pockets. He didn't look surprised, and he didn't move to greet them. One of the officers introduced himself and explained the purpose of their visit. The man nodded once, no resistance, no argument. His calmness, though, didn't sit right with anyone. It wasn't the kind of calm that came from cooperation. It was the kind that felt deliberate, like someone who knew something you didn't. The officers began their inspection. They checked the hull number, the emergency equipment, the paperwork. Some documents were there, but others were missing or incomplete. When asked about them, the man simply said he was new to the boat and hadn't organized everything yet. His voice was steady, polite, but there was a trace of distance in his tone, as if the conversation was happening somewhere far from his thoughts. One officer radioed in the hull identification to cross-check with the registry. The reply came back uncertain. The number wasn't matching any recent entries. That's when the tone on deck started to shift. Routine inspections rely on patterns. Things either line up or they don't. When they don't, it's usually paperwork, but once in a while, it's something bigger. The lead officer asked again for identification, and this time, the man hesitated. It wasn't long, just a brief pause, but in situations like this, even a second of silence can stretch. He reached into his jacket, pulled out a worn wallet, and handed over his ID. The officer looked it over, still casual, still thinking this was another case of a missing form or a mislabeled vessel. He called out for another crew member to verify the name. The man watched in silence as they did. Something in his demeanor began to draw attention. He wasn't nervous, wasn't defensive. If anything, he looked patient, as though he was waiting for them to catch up to something he already knew. The rest of the team continued searching below deck, checking storage compartments and safety gear. Everything seemed clean. No signs of illegal cargo, no extra passengers, no weapons. Just one man on a boat that didn't fully exist on paper. The officer returned from the cabin and asked a few more questions about where he was headed, how long he'd been out, and what his purpose was. Each answer was short and precise, but none gave the full picture. At this point, the Coast Guard officer felt something was off, but couldn't name it. Protocol dictated that when identification doesn't align with the vessel's registry, the safest move is to detain or remove the individual until verification is complete. The sea might seem open and free, but out there, authority matters, and every decision counts. So, with procedure on his side, the officer decided to take control of the situation. He asked the man to step off the boat and come aboard the patrol vessel while they sorted things out. The man didn't argue, but his expression shifted slightly. He gave a faint, almost knowing smile and said something under his breath that none of them caught clearly. Then, without protest, he complied, stepping carefully onto the patrol boat. The officers thought that was the end of it, just another cautious removal to keep things official. They didn't know that what they were about to find out when they ran his ID would make them wish they had handled everything very differently. The moment the man was asked to leave the boat, the tone on deck changed. What had started as a standard check began to feel like something heavier. The officers could sense it. Every movement became more measured, every word more deliberate. The man stood there on the patrol vessel, silent, eyes fixed on the fishing boat, as if he was leaving something behind that he didn't want anyone else touching. The officer in charge ordered another sweep of the boat, just to be sure nothing had been missed, while the rest of the crew kept an eye on their quiet passenger. It wasn't unusual for people to get defensive during inspections. Some yelled, some lied, some tried to charm their way out. But this man didn't do any of that. He didn't resist, didn't explain, didn't even look bothered. His calmness made it hard to read him. That kind of composure under pressure usually meant one of two things. Either he had nothing to hide, or he had everything to lose. The crew couldn't decide which. As the officers moved through the boat again, checking for anything that might justify his silence, tension built in the air. You could feel it in the way no one spoke unless they had to. The officer holding the ID gave it another look. The name seemed ordinary enough, but something about it tickled the back of his mind. He'd heard it before, or maybe he thought he had. He asked the man to confirm his date of birth and address. The man recited them without hesitation. The details matched the card. Still, the officer felt uneasy. He turned to one of the younger crew members and told him to radio in for a background check. The call went through, but there was a slight delay in the response. That delay, combined with the man's stillness, made everyone more aware of how quiet the sea had become. The younger officer, trying to ease the tension, asked casually if the man was out fishing or just passing through. The man turned his head slowly, looked him right in the eye, and said, "I was where I needed to be." Nothing else. No smile, no sarcasm, just that one sentence, said in a tone so even it sent a small chill down the officer's spine. That was the moment they realized this wasn't going to be another easy check. They didn't know what his deal was, but it was clear he wasn't intimidated, not by the uniforms, not by the weapons, not by the authorities standing around him. The inspection team returned from the fishing boat, reporting nothing suspicious on board. Everything checked out except the missing registration records. The captain, now slightly irritated, asked why the man hadn't just updated his paperwork like everyone else. The man shrugged and said, "Because it wasn't mine to update." That answer set off another round of questions, but he refused to elaborate. He stood there, perfectly still, eyes on the water, as if he was waiting for something, or someone, to show up. The officers started to get frustrated. It wasn't that he was being disrespectful, but the lack of cooperation was grinding on their nerves. The more he stayed quiet, the more they filled the silence with suspicion. One of them muttered that maybe he was testing them, trying to provoke a reaction. Another joked under his breath that maybe they'd stumbled onto a spy or a smuggler. The man didn't react to any of it. He didn't even blink. His focus stayed fixed on the fishing boat bobbing gently in the water beside them, the one he had just been forced to leave. The background check was taking longer than usual, and the tension kept growing. The officer in charge decided to press harder. He stepped closer to the man and asked directly who the boat belonged to if it wasn't his. The man looked at him, eyes steady, and replied, "You already know the answer." It wasn't said like a taunt. It sounded like a statement of fact, the kind that makes you realize you've missed something obvious. The officer hesitated. He didn't like riddles, especially not during official duties, but there was something in the man's tone that made him second-guess his own certainty. Another officer interrupted the moment, reporting that the ID system was still processing but had flagged the name for secondary verification. That wasn't normal. Usually, civilian checks were instant. If it required secondary verification, it meant the name appeared in more than one database, sometimes civilian, sometimes military, sometimes classified. The crew exchanged uneasy glances. The lead officer asked the man again who he was. This time, the man didn't answer. He just turned his gaze toward the horizon and stayed silent. The waves hit the hull in slow rhythm, filling the gap his words should have occupied. The tension was no longer subtle. Every person on that deck could feel it. The radio static, the sound of the ocean, the creak of the metal, it all blended into a thick silence that felt like it was waiting to break. The officer tightened his grip on the ID, glancing again at the name, trying to remember where he had seen it before. It wasn't an ordinary name. It carried weight, familiarity, and something about it told him that once the check came back, their day would take a turn they weren't ready for. The decision to remove him from the boat wasn't made lightly, but by that point, the officers felt they had no choice. The man's answers were vague, his documents incomplete, and his silence had turned from suspicious to unsettling. When authority meets uncertainty on open water, the rule is simple. Take control before control is lost. The commanding officer gave the order, and the crew moved quickly to carry it out. The man was told he would be temporarily detained until his identity could be confirmed. He didn't argue, didn't resist. He simply looked at them with a kind of patience that didn't match the situation at all. He stepped back onto the fishing vessel for a moment, collected a small duffel bag from under a bench, and turned to face the officers. One of them motioned for him to leave the bag, standard procedure until it was checked. He handed it over without protest, though his expression hardened for the first time, a faint crease forming between his brows as if he was quietly disappointed rather than angry. The crew escorted him onto the patrol boat. The man moved with a calm precision, every step measured, every gesture deliberate, as though he had done this before. The air on board shifted as soon as he crossed over. The younger officers tried to keep their tone professional, but something about the situation felt wrong. There was no defiance, no panic, none of the usual energy that came when people were caught doing something illegal. Instead, there was a silence that grew heavier by the minute. The man sat on one of the benches near the railing, hands resting on his knees, eyes still fixed on the fishing vessel floating beside them. It was like he was leaving behind more than just a boat. The commanding officer gave instructions to tow the vessel back to port for a full inspection. One of the crew members stepped aboard to start securing lines while another began photographing the interior for records. The man watched them closely but said nothing. A few times, it looked like he was about to speak, but he didn't. He just sat there, his posture straight, the calm in his expression so steady it started to make the others uneasy. People under pressure usually reveal something, a tremor in the hands, a darting glance, a crack in the voice. He showed none of it. The officer holding his ID called again for an update, but the response from command was still pending. It had now been several minutes longer than it should have taken. That kind of delay usually meant someone higher up had taken an interest. Still, procedure required them to continue as if nothing was confirmed yet. They began to process him like any other detainee. One of the crew members pulled out the logbook, jotting down his information as another began asking routine questions. Place of birth, current address, reason for being at sea, employment. Each answer came short, exact, but without emotion. The man wasn't rude. He just spoke like someone who knew these questions didn't matter. Then came the moment that pushed the tension higher. One of the younger officers, frustrated by the silence, muttered something about people who think they're above the law. The man's eyes shifted for the first time, locking onto him with a look that froze the air. Not threatening, not angry, just cold and knowing, like he was looking through the man rather than at him. The young officer went quiet immediately. The commanding officer noticed the exchange but didn't comment. He just made a note in the log and continued the process. Minutes stretched. The patrol boat rocked gently with the current. The radio crackled every now and then but offered no update. The fishing vessel now looked smaller in the distance as they prepared to tow it. The man finally spoke again, his voice low and even, asking if they were done searching. The officer replied that they were following protocol and that he needed to remain calm until verification was complete. The man gave a faint nod, then looked down at the deck, his thumb brushing across the cuff of his sleeve as if he were tracing something beneath the fabric. The commanding officer, uneasy but composed, walked over and crouched slightly to meet his eye level. He told him that if everything checked out, he'd be released without issue. The man looked up and said, "It will check out. It always does." The confidence in his tone wasn't boastful. It sounded factual, inevitable. The officer didn't know how to respond. He straightened up, handed the ID back to the crewman, and ordered them to keep watch. Another 15 minutes passed before the call finally came through from command, but no one reached for the radio yet. The signal light blinked steadily, unnoticed for a few seconds. The man saw it first. His gaze moved toward it, then back to the officer. That same patient expression returned to his face. He leaned back slightly, exhaled once, and waited. The officer turned, noticed the blinking light, and picked up the receiver, not knowing yet that whatever name came through next would change the tone of the entire operation. The radio crackled, cutting through the silence that had settled over the deck. Every head turned toward the sound, the air so still that even the faint static seemed loud. The commanding officer lifted the receiver, answered with his call sign, and waited. The reply came slower than usual, each word carefully spaced, like the person on the other end wasn't sure how to deliver the message. Confirming identity, the voice said, followed by a pause long enough for everyone to feel it. Stand by for verification. Do not proceed with detainment. Those words immediately changed the air on the boat. The officer frowned, pressing the receiver closer to his ear. He asked for clarification, thinking he might have misheard. The response came again, firmer this time, with a slight edge in the tone. Repeat, do not proceed with detainment. Hold position until further instruction. The officer's jaw tightened. He glanced at the man sitting quietly near the railing, the same calm expression on his face, like he had been waiting for this exact moment. The crew exchanged looks, trying to read each other's thoughts without speaking. No one moved. The silence that followed wasn't ordinary. It was charged, expectant. The officer stepped a few paces away, lowering his voice into the radio, asking what was going on, why the hold. The reply came after another delay. We're verifying clearance level. The ID matches a restricted entry. Stand by. The words restricted entry hit differently. They weren't used for civilians. They were reserved for people in classified service, high-level intelligence, or operations that most Coast Guard officers never even heard about. The commanding officer felt his stomach tighten. He looked again at the name printed on the ID, the one that had seemed vaguely familiar before. Now it carried weight. The man hadn't moved an inch. His eyes stayed on the horizon, his posture relaxed. One of the younger crew members whispered under his breath, asking what restricted meant. Another shot him a look to stay quiet. The commanding officer was now pacing slowly, trying to decide whether to keep the man under watch or show some level of respect until confirmation came through. The last thing he wanted was to detain someone who outranked every person on that vessel by miles. But without official clearance, he couldn't take the risk of releasing him either. It was a thin line between authority and mistake. Finally, another transmission came through, this one on a different frequency, one the officer hadn't used in years. The voice on the other end wasn't from local command. It was higher, sharper, and carried the kind of authority that didn't need introduction. Confirm visual on subject, the voice said. The officer hesitated, then replied that they had him on deck, secured, awaiting instruction. Do not engage, the voice said. Repeat, do not engage. We are en route. The words landed like a warning more than an order. Every officer on the patrol boat now felt the weight of something they didn't understand. The commanding officer turned to the man, who was still seated calmly. Sir, he began, his tone changing, softening slightly. I need to know who you are. The man finally looked up, meeting his eyes with a faint smile that wasn't smug, just knowing. You already do, he said quietly. That answer didn't help, but it hit like a truth the officer didn't want to face. He turned away, muttering under his breath that none of this made sense. The crew stood in uneasy formation, unsure whether they were guarding him or guarding themselves. The minutes dragged. The boat rocked gently, the water slapping against the hull in a slow rhythm that seemed to echo the tension. Every so often, the radio buzzed with short updates. Confirmation pending, verification under review, maintain position. The officer replayed the name in his mind, over and over, until finally it clicked. He remembered hearing it years ago during a training session, tied to a story that didn't sound real at the time. It had been about a special operations officer who disappeared off record, declared missing, presumed dead, after an overseas mission went wrong. The name was the same. The photo back then had looked younger, rougher, but the resemblance was there. He felt his throat go dry. If this was the same man, then everything they'd done, the inspection, the confrontation, the removal, had just turned into a serious mistake. He didn't say anything to the crew yet. He didn't want to cause panic or show uncertainty, but his body language had already changed. The man noticed. He didn't gloat, didn't make a scene. He just said, almost kindly, "You were doing your job." That made it worse somehow. The officer nodded stiffly, unsure whether to apologize or stay silent. The crew began picking up on the shift. No one knew exactly what was happening, but they could feel it. The tone of the officer's voice, the delay in radio updates, the way everyone avoided eye contact, it all pointed to something big. The young officer who had spoken out earlier kept glancing at the man, now realizing he might have said the wrong thing. The commanding officer's earpiece buzzed again, another call coming through, this time from a channel marked Command Authority. He answered immediately, listening as the voice on the other end confirmed what he had just begun to suspect. The ID was real. The clearance level was beyond anything they had access to. The man they had pulled off the fishing boat wasn't a criminal, a smuggler, or a civilian at all. He was someone whose presence at sea had a reason far above their clearance to know. The officer's heart sank as he realized the full weight of their mistake. But before he could react, the voice on the radio spoke one final instruction in a tone that left no room for misunderstanding. The voice on the other end of the radio came through steady and cold, the kind of tone that carried authority without effort. "You are to stand down immediately," it said. "Do not question, do not engage, do not attempt to detain. The individual in your custody holds level 7 clearance. You are to treat him as a protected asset." The deck fell into silence. Every officer froze, not quite believing what they had just heard. Level 7 was not a phrase used loosely. Most of them had never even heard it spoken out loud. It was the kind of classification reserved for operations buried so deep in security protocol that they were never meant to reach ordinary ears. The commanding officer repeated the message back, his voice lower, steadier, almost cautious now. "Confirm, level 7?" he asked, as if hoping it was a mistake. The reply was immediate. "Confirmed. Release all hold measures. Maintain radio silence until further notice. Transport en route." Then the line went dead. The sound of the ocean filled the gap where the static had been, a slow rhythmic beat that made the silence heavier. The officer lowered the receiver, his mind racing. He looked at the man sitting calmly on the bench, the same unreadable expression on his face, and everything started to fall into place in the worst possible way. The crew's eyes darted between their commanding officer and the man they had been treating like a detainee. Nobody knew what to say. The officer finally spoke, but his voice had lost its edge. "Sir, it appears there's been a misunderstanding." The man didn't respond right away. He looked at the officer, studying him for a long moment before saying, "You followed your protocol. You didn't know." There was no anger in his tone, no mockery, just a simple acknowledgement of fact. It didn't make anyone feel better. If anything, it deepened the discomfort. The realization that they had just removed a classified operative from his own mission without knowing it hit hard. One of the younger crew members whispered under his breath, asking if this was some kind of setup, maybe a test from higher command. The officer shot him a warning look, but the thought had already crossed everyone's mind. Still, something about the man's presence told them this wasn't a drill. His calmness wasn't the calm of someone pretending. It was the calm of someone who had seen worse, someone used to chaos but unaffected by it. The commanding officer took a step closer, trying to decide whether to offer an apology or just stay quiet. The man spared him the decision. "You were right to stop me," he said quietly. "You just didn't know why." The words hung in the air. The officer felt a strange mix of relief and unease. If the man wasn't angry, that meant they might still walk away from this without disciplinary action, but the mystery behind those words suggested something bigger. The officer finally asked, "What exactly were you doing out there?" The man gave a faint smile and shook his head once. "That's not for your report," he said simply. The officer knew better than to push further. He nodded and stepped back, signaling to his crew to lower their guard. The men obeyed, but their movements were hesitant, as if unsure what standing down really meant in a situation like this. Minutes passed in uneasy quiet. The man remained seated, hands resting loosely in his lap, gaze fixed on the horizon. The commanding officer moved to the edge of the deck, scanning the sky for the transport mentioned over the radio. He couldn't see anything yet. The sea stretched endlessly in every direction, indifferent to the tension on the boat. One of the crewmen quietly returned the duffel bag to the man, setting it beside him. He nodded in acknowledgement, but didn't reach for it. The same crewman noticed a small insignia stitched near the handle, an emblem he didn't recognize, a dark symbol with silver thread that didn't match any known branch of service. He didn't ask about it. The radio came to life again, this time with a short, encrypted burst. The officer recognized the pattern. It was a signal for approach clearance. Somewhere above them, a helicopter was closing in. The low hum started faintly in the distance, then grew louder until it rolled across the water like thunder. The man stood up slowly, adjusting his jacket, brushing off the faint salt that had settled on his sleeve. He didn't look impatient, just ready, like someone who had done this countless times before. The crew watched as a black helicopter emerged from the haze, unmarked except for a small serial near the tail. It hovered just above the waves, rotor wash sending ripples across the surface. The officer stepped back instinctively. The man gave a small nod, as if signaling that he understood what came next. The side door of the helicopter slid open, and a crew member inside gestured toward him. No words were exchanged. The commanding officer wanted to say something, an apology, maybe, but nothing came out. The man turned to him one last time, meeting his gaze with a steady look that carried no resentment, only finality. "Next time," he said quietly, "check before you act." Then he picked up his duffel bag and walked toward the edge of the deck, where the lift cable had dropped down from the chopper. The wind whipped around the deck, rattling loose gear and sending salt spray into the air. The crew stood in silence as the man clipped himself to the line and began ascending toward the hovering aircraft. Within seconds, he was lifted off the deck, the downdraft from the blades pushing the officers back a few steps. The helicopter rose higher, turned sharply, and vanished into the horizon without another word exchanged. The only thing left behind was the heavy silence and the lingering question of who, exactly, they had just escorted off their boat. The helicopter's sound faded into the distance, leaving the patrol boat in an uneasy quiet that felt heavier than the ocean air itself. For a long time, no one spoke. The crew just stood there, staring at the spot where the man had been moments earlier. The sea was calm again, but something about it felt different now, as if the water itself carried the weight of what had just happened. The commanding officer was the first to move, his expression set, the kind of face that looked like it was trying to hold back questions that would never have answers. He took a slow breath, looked at his crew, and said quietly, "Secure the deck." It was all he could think to say. The men moved mechanically, pulling in the tow lines, checking the gear, pretending to focus on their work. But their minds weren't on the task. Every one of them replayed the last hour in their head. The man's calm demeanor, the missing paperwork, the hesitation in his voice, the order to stand down. None of it made sense. The youngest crew member, the one who had spoken out earlier, couldn't stop glancing at the empty bench where the man had been sitting. He finally whispered, "Who was he?" Nobody answered. The question hung in the air, unanswered because no one had the courage or the clearance to try. The commanding officer went back to the radio, switching through channels, but there was nothing. No follow-up transmission, no acknowledgement from command, no official record of what had just taken place. It was as if the entire incident had been erased before it even happened. He scribbled a few notes in the ship's log out of habit, then stopped halfway through a sentence. He realized that whatever he wrote wouldn't matter. Someone, somewhere, would read the report and make it disappear. That was the way it worked with things above your pay grade. The rest of the crew began to talk in low voices. Some thought the man was a government agent. Others whispered about black ops or intelligence missions. One of them swore they'd seen his name before, printed in an old briefing years ago about a covert rescue mission that went wrong overseas. Another said that wasn't possible because the person in that story had died. The rumors spun in circles, none of them certain, all of them uneasy. The commanding officer listened in silence, not to correct them, but because he was wondering the same thing. The fishing boat they'd boarded earlier still floated nearby, rocking gently against the current. The officer gave the order to leave it where it was. A recovery team would come for it later, he assumed. He didn't want to touch it again. Something about that vessel felt off now, like a place that didn't belong to them. He stood by the railing, staring at it, and the thought crossed his mind that maybe they had stumbled into something they were never supposed to see. The longer he looked, the clearer that feeling became. When the sun began to drop, painting the water in deep gold, the crew's tension started to fade into exhaustion. They had all seen strange things at sea before, but this was different. This wasn't a storm, or a rescue, or a smuggling bust. This was something that didn't fit any rulebook. The officer finally gathered the men and told them they were to file only a minimal report. Standard inspection, no conflict, no detainment. He didn't mention the helicopter, the clearance level, or the name on the ID. The men nodded without question. No one wanted to be the one who put it on paper. As night fell, the sea grew dark and reflective. The patrol boat cut a quiet path back toward the coast, the only sound the steady hum of the engines. Most of the crew stayed below deck, pretending to rest, but the truth was no one could stop thinking about it. The youngest officer sat alone near the stern, staring into the black water. He thought about the man's last words. Check before you act, and the way he'd said them, not like a warning, but like advice from someone who had seen far worse consequences. Those words stuck with him in a way that nothing from training ever had. The commanding officer remained on the bridge, hands gripping the wheel even though the autopilot was engaged. His mind ran through every moment of the day, every decision he'd made. He wasn't angry or embarrassed, just unsettled. It wasn't just that they had detained someone important. It was that they had looked into the face of something far bigger than they were allowed to understand. He thought about how calm the man had been, how sure of himself, and wondered what kind of life led someone to carry that kind of composure. By the time they reached the harbor, the Coast Guard station lights were glowing against the horizon. The officer looked at them and realized the routine comfort of coming home didn't feel the same anymore. The dock crew would ask how the patrol went, and they would answer the way they always did. Quiet shift, nothing unusual. But everyone on that boat would know it was a lie. They would go back to their routines, their reports, their inspections, but there would always be that one story they wouldn't tell. The next morning, when the report was filed, it was short, barely a paragraph. A standard inspection conducted, one unidentified vessel cleared, no violations recorded, no further action required. No mention of the man, no mention of the helicopter, no mention of the order to stand down. The file was stamped, logged, and archived like every other entry, lost among thousands. But the crew knew better. They carried the memory quietly, the way people do when they've brushed up against something they'll never fully explain. It wasn't fear that stayed with them. It was the understanding that some parts of their job were meant to be seen, and others were meant to be forgotten.